Hey everybody, I hope you're excited about block number 3, Rhythm. And this is our third month for our Harmony block of the month. By now you should have your key, which is this sheet here, which indicates the fabrics that we're using for this block of the month. And then we're also this month introducing the Tucker trimmer. So this is a first for this block of the month. And I want you to make sure that you have one of these, especially if you're having trouble with your squares coming out a little too small or they're not correct. The Tucker trimmer method will help solve all your problems when it comes to squaring up your 3.5-inch squares, doing your half square triangles, just all kinds of wonderful techniques that you can use this ruler for. So with the introduction of this month, what's going to change is that you are going to be cutting different size strips. So for the sake of time, I've already cut these in the dimensions that we want for the strips. So instead of cutting the 2-inch and the 4 1/4 like it has asked for in the instructions, we're going to cut bigger so that we can trim down. So on all your fabrics that you have, your green dappled, your pink dancing floral, your olive on point, your purple pop floral, and your green shimmer are the fabrics that you'll be working with this month. So for these 4 fabrics, instead of cutting them 2 inches like the pattern says, I have cut them 2.5. And that's because we're going to use the Tucker trimmer. So if I lay the ruler on this green shimmer, you can see that it measures 1, 2.5. So these 4 strips are going to be cut 2.5 by 21. On these 2 strips, the pattern calls for it to be cut 4 1/4. You're going to cut them 4 3/4 for this one and for this one. So make sure that you are cutting a 1/2 inch bigger than what the pattern is instructing you to cut. Then the next thing you're going to do is rotate your fabrics, and you're going to cut them going the opposite way, and it tells you in the book that on, for example, here you're going to recut into 24. It says 2-inch, you're going to go to 2.5. Here you're going to recut into 8 2.5s. So replace the 2s with 2.5 and replace the 4 1/4 with 4 3/4, and that way you will have room to trim down using the Tucker trimmer method. Please make sure before we actually do go to the sewing machine that you have your Quilter's Magic Wand, your Tucker trimmer, and you can see here in the layout that I have my 2 colors that are supposed to be cut 4 3/4 inches, and I have my squares, which originally by the book were supposed to be cut 2, and now they're each 2.5-inch squares. This is going to make a world of difference, and when you get to where you're actually using the Tucker trimmer, this is a game changer for you. I know that some of you have been frustrated in that your squares aren't coming out the size that they need to be, or they're coming out a little small, or they're a little what everybody calls wonky. So we're going to introduce this Tucker trimmer so that everybody can have beautiful squares and not have to worry so much about their scant quarter or did they use a 1/4-inch foot, because this is going to take all the guesswork out of getting your squares the size they need to be. So now let's thread up our sewing machine and let's get busy. Okay, so now we're at the sewing machine, and I wanted you to see the layout of how we're going to sew these together. So the first thing we're going to do is sew the purple to the green, and then we're going to sew the light green to the dark green, and then we're going to do a set of these. So in actuality, you're going to make 16 of these, and you're going to make 4 of these. But I have them laid out so that you can see how we're going to construct these. I'm going to lay this one on top, and then I'm going to stitch using my 1/4-inch foot. And let me turn the camera now so that you can see what it is that I'm about to do. And I can't wait for my daughter to come back and be my photographer. So when I sew these, I'm going to put on my 1/4 inch foot. And I do love this because this machine has snap-on feet. And I am using a baby lock for the purposes of this video. And you can see that my 1/4 inch foot has a little seam right here, or not a seam, but it's got a guide that's going to let me do a perfect 1/4 inch seam. Now, if you're kind of new to sewing and you want to go slow, the speed control over here on the top of the machine can keep you from going too fast. I'd rather you go slow and get a little bit more familiar and accurate with your machine than I had for you to sew fast. You can see here that I have sewn these two together using a 1/4 inch seam, and it says in the book to press toward the dark side. Now I am finger pressing this. That's all I'm doing for now, just to save time on the video. I would normally go over to the pressing wool pressing mats that I have here in the classroom, and I would press these, but I'm just going to finger press. And so we've sewn the first one together, and now I'm going to get the second one. I'm going to put the edges together, and I'm going to stitch using my 1/4 inch foot as a guide. And I do love the fact that it has an automatic trimmer, makes it so much easier. And you can see that I now have the bottom half of the 4 patch. And again, it says to press to the dark side. I love that, press to the dark side. I'm just finger pressing for the purposes of the video. So now I'm ready to sew this one to this one. And that will complete my first 4 patch in this color sequence. Now this is really crucial. When you fold these over on each other, you're going to want to learn a technique called nesting. And what nesting is, and you can trim all these little threads off too to make it a little easier to see. Nesting is when these two seams come together, just like that. It's almost like this is a little speed bump right there, and the speed bump is going the other way. Now it's important, and that's why they have us pressing to the dark side, is it's more of a feel thing right here, but if you open this up, you can see how perfectly nested that is. And I want those nested as well together as you can get, and you'll be able to tell if they are when you rub your finger across this. Once you have that, this is the really awesome part about learning how to nest. Your seam will be facing against the direction that you're sewing in. And what that does is it forces this top seam into, or nested into, the one below it. Now you'll notice that I'm not using any pins. And once I learned how to nest, it made me love quilting or piecing even more. Because when you learn how to nest, I want you to see this. It doesn't get better than that. Look how perfectly my seams are together, and it's because I nested, meaning I stitched against the seam, and they went to each other. There was no space in between. And when you open it up, it is a perfectly nested 4 patch. So we'll go to the next one. This one requires the green and the purple dancing, and the names are in the book, and you have your key. I haven't quite committed all of them to memory yet. We'll sew the top row. Now you could chain, just keep sewing and put your next 2 down, but because I have a trimmer, I love using the trimmer, and it saves me having to go back and cut all those apart after I'm finished. There's our top row. We're going to press, finger press, and then we're going to go get the next row. We're going to lay this over, put our edges together. And I hope you guys can see. I think it's more important that you see the actual stitching than it is to see me. But I hope I'm guiding you in the right fashion that you want to learn. So again, we have sewn them together, and we're going to press to the dark side. We'll go get our first one, and you'll see that they're at an angle from each other. We're going to flip this one down, and we're going to do the nesting thing. And you can feel when those two go together. Just rub your finger across it, and when you have them, just gently put them against the bed of the machine. And the nice thing about this is, yes, I do want to sew nice and straight, but I don't have to worry about my seam allowance and is it exact, and do I need to do a scant quarter, or the pattern calls for an exact 1/4 inch. So I am doing the best I can to get a 1/4 inch. I trim, but the nice thing is my exactness doesn't have to be here. It's going to be when we get to the tucker trimmer. So once again, you see how perfectly that is nested and without any pins. So I hope you're enjoying using this method where we've cut bigger. And I'm going to turn this off just for a second so that we can regroup, and we're going to move on to the 4 3/4 inch squares. But I think you're going to be really pleased with how this month's block comes out and how much easier it is and less stress on you than trying to get those seams exact and get your squares to come out exactly 3.5. So let's move on. So here we are with our Quilter's Magic Wand. We have moved on to the larger 4 3/4 inch squares, and I have put right sides together using the green olive on point and the pink dancing floral. Right sides together, and now the beauty of the Magic Wand is that, and I hope you can see it, yes, on the video here, right in the middle of this little guide is a light etched in line. That is going, the line in the middle of this guide is going to go from point to point of my squares. Once I have it there, I'm going to take my friction pin and I am going to mark on this side, and I'm going to switch and I'm going to mark on the other side. So this is a wonderful little tool. You can see it's not like having to get my big 24 by 6 inch ruler over here and try to do a marking. I'm not using the grid of the mat. I'm simply using the Magic Wand. It's so much easier to do the squares this way because most times they'll tell you to cut down the middle and then you have to go back and make a 1/4 inch seam. And because you're working on the bias now, it can be a little tricky and make your squares distorted. So by marking where I'm going to sew, then I'll later come back and actually cut them apart. So now let's go back to the machine, and forgive me if I make you dizzy. I'll try to do this slowly. And let me scoot that just a hair that way so you can see. And now I'm going to remove my 1/4 inch foot. I'm going to go to my regular foot. Now I do love this baby lock foot because it's curved so it doesn't snag. It's clear in the middle, and it's also snap-on. So I'm using it to sew with, and I'm going to sew exactly on the line that I have just drawn. using the quilter's magic wand. Now, I like to not turn my fabric. Because I have sewn this way and because I am sewing on the bias, a lot of times you'll see where your fabrics will give you that little kind of ripply effect. So by sewing in the same direction, I'm avoiding that. I have my lines to sew on, so I don't necessarily have to turn it and come back the other way. This is just keeping it from getting those little ripples because you're sewing against the first stitching line. Okay, so now you can see where I've sewn, and what I'm going to do is come back to the cutting mat, and now I'm going to take my scissors or rotary cutter. I'll use my scissors because my rotary cutter is on the other table, and I'm going to cut down the center. That gives me, voila. I'm going to again press to the dark side, and I'm just finger pressing. You don't want to press too hard because it is on the bias, and you don't want to make the mistake of stretching that out and it causing you trouble. So I'm just lightly finger pressing that open. And I go ahead and get rid of some of the loose threads. Now what it wants you to do is lay these two squares on top of each other, because you're going to wind up with this. So I like to kind of check my work, because you could see if I had turned it the other way like I was going to do, then I would not have the correct square. By placing a green over a pink dancing, I'm going to again make a mark. So I have right sides together, and I am going to draw. And you see how just by sewing these that I'm off just a little bit. I'm going to take this time and mark using that line again, and I'm going to go through point to point, and I'm going to mark with my friction pen my stitching lines. Now, tip number one, make sure you close your friction pen up. Otherwise, it will dry out overnight if you don't use it. You can see that I have my lines, and now I'm ready to sew. Again, I'm going to use the nesting method, and you can feel those. If I pinch that right there, you can see how I have those nested together. And without using pins, I'm going to lay that up on my machine, turn my camera so you can see. We'll scooch it a little bit. There we go. And now I'm going to stitch against the seam here. And whether I'm on the line or a little bit off of the line really doesn't matter, because my squares are big enough that we're going to trim them down. Again, because I want to nest, I'm not going to turn my fabric. I'm going to sew against this. Now I'm ready to again, I'll try not to turn the camera this time, but we are going to cut this apart. And when you do, voila. Look at that. No pins are necessary. That's because you're learning how to nest your seams. If you haven't learned anything from this video today, I hope that you have learned nesting, because it's going to make your piecing life so much easier. What I have to do next is open all these up, go over to the pressing mat, and I'm going to start pressing so that we can assemble our square. So let's go press. Now it's time for the tucker trimmer. This has several uses, but for the purpose of this, we're going to be using the 1/2 inch marks. You'll know if you're using the 1/2 inch because it's going to have a half circle right here. The half circle indicates that you're working in 1/2 inches. If I turn this around, you can see that on the other side is a full circle, which means that you're working in increments of 1 inch. So make sure that you're on the side using the 1/2 inch. And let me straighten this up just a little bit. What I'm going to do, because you can tell that even as careful as I was, that things get a little wonky, which is not what you want when you've started out with a precisely cut pieces, and then you wind up with them a little off. With the tucker trimmer, my finished square is supposed to be 3 1/2. So the first side that I'm going to trim, and how I know to trim it, is that when I have this line going from point to point, and I can also check my work here and here to make sure that my lines are straight, I'm going to put the 3 1/2 inch dotted line exactly through the center of where I nested those seams. And once I have that, then I can cut or trim 3 1/2 to 3 1/2. And that's great. Now I'm going to take and turn my fabric so that I'm at the other point. And now I'm going to use the 3 1/2 inch dotted line, and I'm going to put it against the edge of where I just trimmed. Is this not awesome? So there's my 3 1/2 inch line. It goes on the cut edge that we just did. And now I'm going to trim the other 2 sides. Oops. A little different when you're doing this with a video camera in between you. So now you can see that I have a perfect 1, 2, 3 1/2, the same here. There is my 3 1/2 inch perfectly cut square, as opposed to cutting my pieces perfectly to begin with and then sewing them, and they're not giving me exactly 3 1/2. So I'm going to spend a little time trimming. But before I do, I want you to see the next one that we're going to do. Again, we're looking at 3 1/2. Now you'll see the markings on this make a little bit different on this one, because now I have my line to go by. Instead of going point to point, I'm going by the seam. And this is just amazing. I love the fact that she came up with this ruler, because I have my line here and I've got my 3 1/2 here. And now I'm ready to trim. So you see here, I'm going to cut And I'm going to cut. Then I'm going to turn this around. I'm going to lay the solid line with the 3.5 inch dotted line here, and you can check all angles. You'll notice that here my 3.5 is here, my solid line is here. I'm going to hold my ruler in place, and I'm going to trim and trim. I love this tool because it makes everything so much easier, because when I go to sew these together, I want you to see how nicely they match up. Just absolutely awesome, and it's fun when you can avoid having the frustration of your squares not being the right size. So thank you, Tucker Trimmers. I'm going to finish trimming these squares up. I've got a few more to do, and then we'll come back and do the assembly. Now that I have everything cut to size 3.5, the first row is going to be laid together like this. I'm going to flip this over to get my seam allowances together. Now I don't have to worry about nesting because this is just a solid piece that we're sewing against. But I am going to now match my edges because that's why I trimmed. I'm also going to switch out to my 1/4 inch foot. Again, very easy to do. This guide is up against the edges of the fabric, and I'm going to stitch. Now I like to use a stitch length of about 2 or 2.5 for this. And there's my first seam, and you can tell, and this is what's really great about the Tucker trimmer, is I have a 1/4 inch from there to there on both sides. So now I'm going to grab the other square that goes on the other corner over here. I'm going to flip that over, making sure that both of these dark purples are in the upper corner. So let's flip these two together, put our corners together because we know that they're exactly 3.5 inches. Press our foot down. Trim, and we'll check again to have 1/4 inch there and 1/4 inch there. So our first row is done. The second row is going to be comprised of the same squares. So again, we're going to do dark purples in the outside corners. The green triangles are going to be pointing toward the center. We'll do another one, corner to corner. Trim. Again, 1/4 inch, 1/4 inch. Flip this one over to here. Ooh, make sure when you press that your seams don't get twisted. Easy enough to do. Edges together. This completes our second row, and you will want to go press that over to the side. Again, 1/4 of an inch there, 1/4 of an inch at the bottom. That's our top and our bottom row. Our middle row is going to look like this, where your purple is on top and bottom. Your purple here is going to be going upper right to lower left. And then the last one on the edge is going to be the same as the one on the left. So let's sew these, flip this over, and sew these two together. Trim. Again, we have, look at that nice 1/4 inch seam. And this is how your points get cut off, is when you don't have the 1/4 inch that goes from there to there. Then if it's sewn wrong or trimmed wrong, then that's how you can easily cut your point off. When you do the 1/4 inch, then you'll see that right here is where your seam's going to cross, and therefore it doesn't cut off your point. We're going to flip this one over the center square, put our edges together, under the presser foot it goes. Trim. Again, I have perfect 1/4, perfect 1/4, and now I'm ready to go press some more. And I think you've got it from here, but your square is going to go together exactly like this, where your dark purples are up in the corners up here. Your middle one is going to be here, and look at there. Do you see how nicely those seams are going to match up because we trimmed correctly? And then your last one is going to be down in the bottom. Ooh, get underneath that 1/4 inch foot. And so there you have it. You've got 2 seams left to do, and you're going to have a beautifully put together square. And if you go by your diagrams that you were given, you can see here in our colorway that it's going to look like this. Your 4 patches are going to look like this and like this, and then your final assembly is going to be like this. So you sew them in rows. We did this row, then we're doing this row, and then we did this row, and then you're going to sew this row to this one and this row to this one. So I hope you've enjoyed what I think is a fairly easy 3rd month. And if you have any questions, you can always call the store or you can email me. The store number is 423-629-6411. And you can call us if you have any questions about anything. If you want to purchase a Tucker trimmer or a magic wand or even a sewing machine, just give us a call. I hope you've enjoyed this. We're learning as we go about the tools that make what we're doing even more enjoyable. So thanks for joining me.